In 1885, as Europe carved Africa into colonies, a small nation scarcely half a century old set its sights on empire. Belgium, with no great army or overseas possessions, seemed an unlikely contender. Yet its king, Leopold II, was determined to leave his mark on history. With cunning diplomacy, he convinced the European leaders and diplomats that he was on a humanitarian mission to end slavery and bring civilization to Central Africa. In truth, he had secured the Congo as his private property, a colony not of Belgium, but of one man. What followed was a system of forced labor and terror that shocked even the imperial powers of the age. Entire villages were burned, families torn apart, and those who resisted faced brutal punishment, the most infamous being the severing of hands to enforce impossible rubber quotas. This is the story of how a European king turned a nation the size of Western Europe into his personal empire, with side of history. By the late 19th century, the world was entering a new age of empire. The scramble for Africa had begun. One by one, the great European powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, rushed to stake their claims across the continent. Africa, a land of hundreds of cultures, kingdoms, and nations, was being carved into pieces on European maps. For many in Europe, colonies meant wealth, raw materials, and global prestige. But for Africa, it meant invasion, division, and dispossession. Belgium itself was a new country, having gained independence from the Netherlands in 1830. It was small, squeezed between larger powers, and lacked the colonial possessions that France, Britain, or Spain already boasted. But its monarch, King Leopold II, was not content to remain on the sidelines. He was obsessed with prestige and determined to leave behind a legacy that would place Belgium among the great imperial powers. He disguised his ambitions behind the language of philanthropy. In 1876, Leopold founded the International African Association, presenting it as a humanitarian effort to bring science, Christianity, and trade to Central Africa. Behind the curtain, however, it was a calculated scheme to gain territory. He hired explorers like Henry Morton Stanley to chart the Congo River basin and establish outposts, all while presenting these actions as purely charitable. The decisive moment came at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Convened by Otto von Bismarck, it brought together European leaders to divide Africa into spheres of influence, establishing rules to avoid conflicts among themselves. Here, Leopold played the part of benevolent reformer. He convinced rival nations that he sought to combat slavery and open Africa to free trade. By skillfully lobbying and exploiting the rivalries of larger powers, he secured recognition of the so-called Congo Free State. In reality, he was laying the groundwork for personal rule. When the conference ended, Leopold walked away with international recognition of his control over the Congo Free State, an area 70 times larger than Belgium itself. But this state was not Belgian. It was his, privately owned by one man, who now controlled a territory and population greater than most empires. The stage was set. Leopold had his colony, the rivals applauded his supposed humanitarianism, and the Congo's people had no voice in the bargain. However, what began as diplomacy and deception would soon descend into a reign of violence and exploitation, unlike anything Africa had seen before. When Leopold II secured the Congo at the Berlin Conference, he named his new possession the Congo Free State, a name chosen to inspire trust and admiration. But beneath this facade, the Congo was never free. It was a vast business venture, with Leopold as its sole shareholder. At first, the colony focused on ivory, a precious commodity in Europe's markets. But as demand for rubber skyrocketed with the rise of bicycles, automobiles, and industry, Leopold saw his fortune. The forests of the Congo were full of wild rubber vines, and Leopold's agents devised a brutal system to extract it. Congolese communities were forced to gather rubber under impossible quotas. Soldiers of the Force Publique, an army of African recruits led by European officers, were sent to enforce these orders. Failure was met with punishment, beatings, the burning of villages, and, most infamously, the severing of hands. Soldiers were required to present a hand for every bullet fired, proof that no ammunition had been wasted on hunting. The human cost was staggering. Between 1885 and 1908, the population of the Congo was reduced by half. Millions died from violence, starvation, disease, or exhaustion. Entire communities vanished, leaving behind only testimony of terror. While Leopold built grand monuments and palaces in Brussels with Congo's wealth, The people of the Congo lived under one of the most ruthless regimes in colonial history. The mask of philanthropy had slipped. The Congo Free State was revealed not as a humanitarian project, but as one of the greatest human rights scandals of the modern age. By the turn of the 20th century, the truth about the Congo Free State could no longer be hidden. The official narrative of philanthropy and civilization began to collapse under mounting evidence of abuse. Missionaries returning to Europe brought stories of mutilations, forced labor, and mass killings. Photographs of children with severed hands shocked the public, giving faces to the horrors that words alone struggled to convey. One of the most determined voices was Edmund Morel, a shipping clerk turned journalist. He noticed that ships leaving Belgium for the Congo carried guns and ammunition, while those returning were loaded with ivory and rubber. To him, it was clear this was not free trade, but violent exploitation. Morel launched a relentless campaign, publishing articles, speaking across Europe and America, and building a movement to expose Leopold's regime. His ally, the British diplomat Roger Casement, added further weight with a damning official report in 1904 that confirmed widespread atrocities. Together, they helped found the Congo Reform Association, a global network of activists, churches, and human rights campaigners. Their efforts created one of the first international human rights movements, drawing support from writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle, who used their pens to condemn Leopold's crimes. Under growing global pressure, Leopold's reputation crumbled. By 1908, the Belgian parliament could no longer ignore the scandal. Reluctantly, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo Free State to the Belgian government, which then annexed it as a Belgian colony in 1908, a change of rule that ended his personal absolutist reign. Officially, the era of a private colony had ended, but for the Congolese, little truly changed. Exploitation and racial hierarchy remained, even if the most notorious brutality was curbed. The Congo had shifted from being one man's empire to a national colony, but it was still not free. In 1908, Belgium promised reform to Congo. The image of the king's personal empire disappeared, replaced by the idea of a civilizing mission under parliamentary oversight. Some of the most grotesque practices of Leopold's regime were curbed, yet at its core, the system remained exploitative. The Congo was no longer Leopold's colony, but it was Belgium's, and its vast resources were now directed toward fueling the Belgian economy. The most brutal practices of rubber extraction were curtailed, and there was greater oversight from the Belgian government. Under Belgian rule, the colony saw rapid economic development. Infrastructure projects expanded. Railways, roads, and ports were built. Mining operations developed in the copper-rich Katanga region. Plantations produced palm oil, coffee, and cocoa. But these developments were not designed for the benefit of Congolese society. They served Belgian industry and investors. Congolese workers remained at the bottom of the social order, subjected to forced labor and low wages. The colonial society was built on rigid racial segregation. Europeans occupied the highest positions, enjoyed modern housing and education, while Congolese were confined to the margins, excluded from meaningful political or economic power. Education was limited almost entirely to basic primary schools, ensuring that very few Congolese could rise beyond manual labor. By the 1950s, fewer than 24 Congolese had received a university degree. The system deliberately avoided creating an educated elite that could challenge colonial authority. Even as the Belgian Congo grew into one of the most profitable colonies in Africa, its people remained voiceless in their own land. By the mid-20th century, the winds of change were blowing across the continent. In Asia and Africa, independence movements gained momentum. Congolese nationalism began to stir, inspired by global decolonization movements. Though decades of deliberate exclusion from politics meant that the movement was fragmented and underdeveloped, by the late 1950s, political parties emerged, demanding independence and self-determination. Figures like Patrice Lumumba emerged, demanding self-rule and dignity for the Congolese people. Belgium, unprepared for the speed and force of Congolese nationalism, soon found its colonial power grip slipping. On June 30th, 1960, the Congo finally declared its independence after more than 70 years of exploitation. First as the personal possession of King Leopold II, then as a Belgian colony. But for the colonizer, the decision came suddenly, almost rushed. After decades of brutality, atrocity, forced labor, and denying Congolese political rights, the colonial state collapsed under the pressure of rising nationalism. Within months of protests and strikes, Belgium formally agreed to hand over power to Congolese people through the newly created institutions of the Republic of Congo, which later renamed Democratic Republic of Congo. Yet the transition was chaotic. The new nation had vast territory, immense resources, but almost no trained administrators, engineers, or political leaders to ensure stability. The Belgian Congo had been built to serve Belgium, not to prepare Congolese for self-rule. Independence was celebrated with euphoria, but also unease. Patrice Lumumba, the country's first prime minister, delivered a fiery speech denouncing colonial exploitation, setting a bold tone for the future. But within weeks, Congo was plunged into crisis. The army mutinied, Belgium intervened militarily, and the mineral-rich province of Katanga attempted to secede with Western backing. The Cold War quickly turned Congo into a battleground for influence. Lumumba sought Soviet support, alarming the United States and Belgium. By early 1961, he was overthrown and assassinated, an event that left deep scars on the nation's political memory. In the years that followed, Joseph Mobutu rose to power, ruling for more than 3 decades. His regime, backed by Western allies, was marked by corruption, authoritarianism, and the further plundering of Congo's wealth. Despite independence, the cycle of exploitation continued, only now in the hands of new elites.